Okay, since we took last week's video down, I want to go back through the whole thing with the first part of James chapter 2. But just again, for those who are tuning in and maybe didn't get to see the video or weren't here that week, just about the first 7 verses of James chapter 2, which is the exhortation by James not to practice partiality. And primarily the example he gives is one of favoring the wealthy over the poor, and doing so based on nothing more than clothing. So it's something that is James chapter 2. And the discussion also includes how the wealthy already have power over our lives and how they use it to exploit the poor and oppress the poor, and certainly did so to the first century church. So when you dishonor the poor person, you're dishonoring really in a sense yourself, and you are lifting up the person who is hurting the poor person and hurting you as well. And the exhortation is, I think, relevant today as we look at how we interact and treat people as a congregation. And when they come here, are we favoring people we think who might have money? Are we not worried about people that might actually cost us money? Are we being Christ-like in the approach we take to maybe even how we as a congregation market? I don't like that term really, but reach out and attempt to connect with the community. It's hard to, even for a large congregation, most of them don't try to target everybody. They pick a group. This is who we want to try to reach out to. And if other people come along, that's great. But if we're going to go after these people, that's who we're going to gear things towards them. And if we gear things away from them, then we're probably not going to get too many of them. But when you gear it towards someone, you kind of are gearing it away from other people. Again, if they come along, that's wonderful, but that's not really who we're trying to reach. I think that's it's a little cold-blooded in a way, but it is also kind of inevitable. And when you're a small congregation and you don't have all the resources in the world, you really do have to make some hard choices with how you do things. And we need to look at how we make those choices, what we try to court. And there are small, very wealthy congregations made up of a few very wealthy people. That's not us. We're a small, poor congregation. So we are really trying to make good decisions, good choices, sustainable choices, things that keep us as a congregation alive and growing, hopefully, not just spiritually, but numerically, so that we can be of service and a witness for God in this community. Anyway, that's what we kind of talked about last week. So let's get into some new material this week. So verses 8 through 13. If, however, you are fulfilling the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the law and yet stumbles in one point has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, has also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciless upon to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. What do you think about that? Nothing in particular.
Are we so simple sometimes that they got to say, even if you don't commit adultery but do commit murder, you become a lawbreaker?
Well, those are two pretty frontline. They're both in the Ten Commandments for one thing. But yes,
if you don't do even if you don't do this, if you do this, and especially murder, you become a lawbreaker. Well, duh. I don't know what I'm trying to say, I guess, it seems.
You're done.
Maybe the first 12 and 13, as I look at what was said about between murder and adultery, but yet, what is this really about? To me, it's judging. So in verse 13, for judgment is without mercy for one that is shown no mercy. So I think we have to be a little cautious on how we define mercy today versus mercy that this is talking about here. Because a lot of people think of mercy as giving all, when mercy can be so many different things, I believe. That, just like we've done recently, is it being merciful to Mark and Karen? I think what was done was merciful to them. It was helping them. It was meeting a need they have. Now, am I going too far for the word mercy? I'm asking now.
Well, compassion and is I think where it's mercy and where it's compassion. Perhaps mercy is when you have a power or a right to do one thing, but you do not exercise it. And compassion is just simply acting out of care and love for someone. With Mark and Karen, whatever we're doing for them is compassion.
But then again, it probably depends too on the person who's doing it. Meaning, if they haven't thought about it, if they haven't in their mind said, "Oh, I need to do this to help my fellow Christian," and for them, that might be more merciful.
Mhm.
So, I guess I'm trying to look at it as the point of view that I've heard over the years. People say, "Now we helped out this couple or this person or whatever, but they didn't deserve it." And I think in my mind, why are you even doing it? If you have that thought in your mind, you're not either being compassionate or merciful.
Mhm.
It's almost like coming here and partaking of the Lord's Supper. You know, I did my duty today, but you're not really thinking about Christ and what.
Like it's if you help someone out who's having a hard time financially, and then 2 years later they're driving a brand new car. Are you mad at them for driving the brand new car because you helped them, or do you think?
Were they starving?
Yeah, it's life can change quickly, especially in our culture. And this is another the scriptures we normally do understand them in our cultural context, and that's okay as long as we know. I think that we're doing that. When we go back and try to the best of our abilities, try to discern and put those things in the original context, it can look very differently. What is merciful in our context may not be, and what is compassionate in our context may not have been compassionate back then. And I've told a few of y'all a story, and this doesn't involve a minor, so I don't mind putting this out there. But there was a young man who he was trying to put his life back together, and he seemed like a nice guy, and he was kind of going in the right direction, but he had no warrant for something that really wasn't that bad, but he had to basically spend a few days in jail, maybe a month even, I don't recall. But when he got out, I met him at the jail. I took him out to breakfast and bought him a nice breakfast and drove him to his mother's apartment and gave him $20. That was on a Saturday morning. Sunday night, me and one of the elders from Aberdeen were driving to Harborview in Seattle to pick him up. That $20 almost killed him because of what his weaknesses were. Now I was trying to be nice and give him a chance, give him a little bit of pocket money to kind of maybe be happy that he's back out and enjoy his life, but it almost killed him. So it may have been intended as an act of compassion, but that's not the upshot of it. So what you're saying, and particularly with addicts in our culture, sometimes what is intended or what our compassionate hearts, to whatever extent we have them, motivate us to do is not really compassion. That it actually enables very self-destructive behavior where we may be trying to save them, but really we're killing them. So it's a hard line to walk, I think.
Using any individual, sometimes you don't know either. You do the best you can, and then you find that this was. Now, if you know certain things about an individual, to me, I can go do this, but if I take this person with me, that's putting them at risk. I know that. Yeah, I think the mercy that I believe I'm reading about here too is we have to think about a lot of these people that are restricted or in slavery.
Yes.
And so mercy would be maybe given an extra hour off so they can get their food made for the night because they've been out there working and doing their master's bidding all day.
Well, we talked about that a little bit last week in the context of appearances and clothing and all that. The early church had a lot of slaves in it, and clothing was really, and this was the point I didn't make, but clothing was really a coveted thing. Most people didn't have a closet full of clothes, and yeah, they had their tunic, maybe one change, maybe not, but wealthy people had a lot. But you look back, and I know this predates this context, but the story of Naaman, when he goes to see Elisha, one of the things he tries to use to buy the miracle to heal his leprosy is a bunch of changes of clothes, because most people just didn't have them. But wealthy people today, and I think I would use this example, in a lot of the places in this part of the world, not so much maybe Greco-Roman world, but in like Arabia, those areas, it's still, of course, the weather hadn't really changed. Hot, dry, dusty. And they have some air-conditioned places, but a lot of the markets and things like that are still outdoors. And they will, the wealthier people who work and own those things will start out the day in one set of clothes, be out there for a little while, do some work, get hot, sweaty, dusty, dirty, go in to their home, take off those, we know they still wear basically the robes. They will take off those robes and they have a little kind of plunge pool. They'll go into the water. They're not really taking a bath, but they are immersing themselves in water to get all that dirt and grime and dust off, getting back out, and then, and Paul uses this example, they don't put the dirty clothes right back on, do they? They put on a fresh set of clothes. What good would it do to put the dirty clothes back on? You put on the newness of life. You put on a new life. And so Paul is kind of drawing on that imagery where he's talking about that. But clothing, most of us have closets full of clothing we never wear, we never get around to. Sherry and I are, in the process of trying to move, and I'm terrified at the prospect of moving all of our clothing over here. And it's that's just part of our culture. And for us, clothing is cheap, in part because it's made by people who don't make very much money in other countries. So we can think about all that all we want to, and go wherever we want to with that. But I think back kind of to, I guess, PD's point about, these are two things you shouldn't do, and if you don't do one, you can't do the other. You shouldn't do the other. I think these are extreme examples, adultery and murder, because they are both very clearly wrong, and they are very fundamental, not just to Judeo-Christian life, but all cultures frown upon, maybe not all cultures frown upon adultery, but most of them do. And they do, almost every culture frowns upon murder. And it's just these are two clear, bright examples that you can't say, I didn't break this law, so I get to break that law. Driving right now in our area is a little dicey. You may or may not be able to handle it well. Even if you are able to handle it well, someone else may not handle it well. And if you handle it well for 3/4 of a mile, but the last quarter of the mile you don't handle it very well, then you haven't handled it very well. So it's a lot of different considerations. You can't stop at every stop sign 4 in a row and then run the 5th one either, can you? So that's, you can, we all have done it, but it's not the goal. It's not the agenda. So there is this desire to be consistent in keeping the law. And this law comes back to, at the beginning of this section of the text, is about loving your neighbor. And connecting loving your neighbor to partiality, basically, James is saying, if you practice partiality, you can't love your neighbor. These two things can't exist. If you look at someone and judge them based on outward appearances, then you can't love them. If you look at someone that come to church and you don't like their clothes they're wearing, and you want them to leave, then you don't love them. Yes, ma'am.
I've had an experience, and I still think about it. And I worked at a mini mart in Turner, Oregon, and this guy kept coming in and buying beer all the time, and he always had a bad back, and I was sympathizing and being really nice to him and saying good things. He ended up killing his wife, and I kept asking him where his wife was that I had to saw her. He had put her in a freezer and had kept her for like 6 months in a freezer, bringing other women in. When I found out what he had done, I was so mad that I had been nice to him. And I just regretted how bad I was. So I don't know
Well, you weren't bad. You were being compassionate. And God judges, that's the closing sentiment. Judgment will be merciless to the one who shows no mercy, but mercy triumphs over judgment. So when you're merciful, and I think it maybe applies to your situation and my story about helping the young man, God looks at what we were trying to do and not looking at the outcome of it. I mean, you weren't enabling the man to murder his wife. In fact, you were kind of holding his feet to the fire a little bit about it. Where's your wife? I haven't seen her in a while. What do you need that hacksaw for? You know, kind of. So, where's that rope going? I'm reenacting Rear Window now. I want to share his favorite, but which has Perry Mason in it. He's the bad guy in that one. You know, and when you give money out of kindness, out of compassion, and the person uses it to kill themselves on drugs, you didn't murder them. But if you gave them the money knowing they were going to do that and you wanted them to kill themselves, that's where God can judge. Yes.
Why he killed her when he was arrested.
Okay.
He killed her because he was afraid she was going to find out he was on drugs. That's why he killed her.
Well, she never found out, did she? She never told a soul about it. You know, it's,
She did, and she was alone herself. And she was in the Bible class for the people that own the store. She was coming to Bible class, and I was so mad when he said that. They found out. But I hope I wasn't really bad.
well, we'll leave it up to God now. We'll let him to judge. Yeah. So, yes, ma'am.
Jay was asking this yesterday, and I can't remember where the verses are. This, it says do not commit adultery. But I know it says somewhere that if you think in your heart, that's committing adultery. Because he said, what do I tell this guy that he wants to keep in touch with? But the guy sends him all these videos about women. He says he's a pervert, and I don't want to see them. I want to tell him that it's wrong, just as wrong as adultery, and this. And I don't remember where those scriptures are.
Well, it's in Matthew, I think 5. It's around Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe chapter 6. I'm not sure. I'm not great at memorization.
We'll figure it out. We'll find it for you.
Yeah, I think Jay's trying to be a good example and push the guy away from something he shouldn't really be doing. And you know, it's a difficult engaging the world where it's at versus and trying to connect and shape and bend the lives of human beings towards Christ, trying to play a role and be the instrument by which God does that, I really should say. And quickly finding yourself as enabling people to do things they shouldn't do and condoning things they shouldn't do is a real question. And it's God knows our hearts and he knows their hearts. And I admire Jay for his attitude on it. And I hope he can. Sometimes we have to pray for discernment on these things and know that there's probably not going to be a perfect answer. You feel like if I cut off communication with him, I'll lose any chance to have some influence. And maybe you will. But at the same time, you don't want to be influenced by that person. So
It is Matthew 5, it's 26 and 27. 27 and 28.
But, you know, and another thing is, as Christians, a lot of time, particularly in our context, we like to talk about grace and mercy and forgiveness and the idea that we have maybe escaped judgment, that we will not be judged. And yet we are judged. You know, James says here, we will be judged. We're going to be judged by the law of liberty. You know, the law that you talked about in chapter 1, the perfect law of liberty. And even Paul says that we will all give an answer for our deeds. So just because we're saved, in a sense, we're saved from what we were as human beings to given a new life, and again, still as a human being. And then we will be saved ultimately, but we will still be judged.
We have that. Use the word liar. We have
Mhm.
a person that's going to say, he's one of mine.
Yes.
He's one of mine. And so, and that's to me is a former elder and deacon all the way through my whole career as a Christian. Is talking to people that couldn't say, I don't think, and they're Christian. You say, I just don't think I'm going to be saved. I don't think they've really understood, and Darius has done a good job of looking, that we are saved sinners. Yeah, that's it. I mean, if we say we don't, there's a passage in there that says we're liars. So it's hard sometimes to get, that's not an easy concept for most of us. I know for me, I've had to think about that for a long time. And Connie's sister is that way. She doesn't think she can be saved. She's done too many things. Well, but the things she's done, she's not been a murderer. She's not been, and even if she was a murderer, what does it say? Forgiveness. What did Christ say on the cross? So every time I think of those things, I say, okay, think about Christ and what he did, and how far does that cleansing go? As far as I know, except for the unforgiven sin, it goes all the way.
No, we'll get, that's a whole nother topic. It's a very interesting one.
I don't want to leave it out, but I just want to say that Christ's death on the cross and his ability to love us and to save us is without condition, in the sense that he went all the way. He didn't condition upon, well, maybe I'm halfway dead, or maybe I will do this. No, he did what God wanted him to do.
And if he loved us enough to do that, how should we love the people that are, even the ones who are in rebellion to God, because we were in rebellion to God when he came to us. So rather than judge, we should love. Yes, ma'am.
On this mercy thing, actually, verse 13 really shows the difference between mercy and compassion. Mercy is when you have the authority to do something like a judge or whatever of that nature. You can, mercy withholds something that's coming to you rightly. But mercy can overrun the fact that you have the authority to withhold this. You can withhold it because you have the.
If I owe you a certain amount of money, and I don't have to pay, but you said, you give me the money, or I'm going to send you to prison or to jail, which happened in the past. And you said, no, I realize you're going to go to jail, so you don't owe it to me. So you show mercy to me, because you have the ability to put me in jail. Go ahead. Yeah.
But mercy is usually an act of compassion. So it is not, it's not like the two things don't have anything to do with each other.
Right.
But mercy would be maybe even in a sense require more compassion, because you have to get over your rights.
Give up something yourself.
You have to, and it's just like forgiveness. Ultimately, when you have to forgive someone, you have to value the person and the relationship you have with them more than your victimization.
Well, it's hard.
And that's very hard. Yes, ma'am.
It's hard because there was a woman that studied and brought Jeffrey Dahmer to Christ. He was baptized. To just think of that man being allowed in heaven with all the horrible things that he did is hard, but it's up to God. He he's the one that decides whether he's being true to what his beliefs, and it's up to him. The woman did what she felt she needed to do, and that was to try to talk to him about his soul and convert him to him.
And I think people, understandably, I don't want to say hi, Robin. Glad you're tuned in, but people understandably will say things like, "If that's your faith, and I don't want any part of it. If he's in heaven, I don't want to be there." That type of thing. It's not easy. And forgiveness, I think a lot of times we tell people, and we've told women whose husbands have beat them, we've told women whose husbands have cheated on them and stuff like that, to say, well, you got to forgive him. He's sorry, so you got to forgive him.
But you don't have to stay there and let him do it again.
Well, that's part of it. That's the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, or we've talked about it before. We'll talk about it again some other time. But just true, authentic, real forgiveness is a very difficult task. And if the harm is bad enough, it is a process. It is not a quick result. It's not something you get to immediately. And to say, okay, well, you're forgiven or whatever, you can say it and not really do it. And you can't really force it on people. Now, Jesus certainly links our forgiveness to our forgiving of others. So I'm not trying to let us off the hook for it, but I am trying to acknowledge that if you've been deeply and grievously wronged, and some people have, that it is not easy. And if you're struggling with forgiveness, if you're struggling with forgiving someone, and everyone is telling you, well, you just got to forgive him, don't feel like you have to be able to get there right off the bat. It may take time. It may take years. Someone may have done something to you that is far worse than you're even capable of doing to someone else. That may be, you may have been wronged worse than you could ever wrong anybody else. Certainly that's possible in your own perspective when you look at it. But we all wrong each other at some point. Everybody hurts everybody else. Relationships are not about not hurting each other. They're about reconciling and healing and moving on and forgiving. Whoever came up with the phrase "love means never having to say you're sorry" is the biggest idiot in the world. Love means you're willing to say you're sorry.
And mean it.
And mean it.
Through your act,
So this is, in a sense, you think about the examples that he uses of adultery and murder seem extreme, but then you back it off and you look at our daily lives and how we interact with each other. And we don't always commit adultery. We don't always murder, but we do harm. And when Jesus says lusting in your heart, you've committed adultery in your heart. Does that mean, the person you're lusting after, their spouse, can have you stoned to death? I'm not going to get into all those fine points, but Jesus' point is not just to change our outward manifestation, but what's in our hearts. And we like to say garbage in, garbage out. Jesus says if there's garbage coming out, then there is garbage in. He changes those words around a little bit. Instead of garbage in, garbage out, Jesus says if there's garbage coming out, there's garbage in. However it got in there, it doesn't matter. It's coming out, and that's garbage in there. And it's not what you take in that corrupts you. It's not what you eat. It's not, I think you can say a lot of things. It's not what you take in that corrupts you. It's what you express that corrupts you. It's what you actually do. And I think that supports some of when you're talking about salvation by works versus salvation by faith, and the so-called conflict between James and Paul, I don't really think Paul would have had a big problem with a lot of what James has to say. And we'll look at that more when we get into that particular portion of text. In fact, we're on the very cusp of it.
So going back to your forgiveness thing, and that person that's having trouble with it, that forgiveness growth is just like our Christian life growth. We're not always perfect in what we do, but we're striving towards the goal. And they are striving towards the goal of forgiving that person. however small the steps they are taking at the time. But that's what they know that I need to forgive this person, but I'm working on it, you know? And I think that, again, going to the heart is where it's at.
Well, it's kind of, you know, the judgment of God is the only one that ultimately and eternally will matter.
Yep.
And some people have no interest in forgiving. Some people want to but can't yet. And maybe they can keep working on it. They may not get there in their lifetime because their life could end first. So a lot of people have a lot of resentment and anger towards their parents. And I don't usually give out a lot of practical advice on stuff, as you've probably noticed. But one thing that I know someone very close to me did with that person's attitude towards the parent was to write a letter to the parent that did nothing but compliment them and thank them for what was good in their life. You know, if you're not happy with everything your mom or your dad did to you or did for you while you were growing up, guess what? Nobody has perfect parents. I had wonderful parents, they're not perfect. And you may need help dealing with the harms they've brought into your life. They harmed you when you were the most vulnerable too, when you couldn't defend yourself. You may need to kind of deal with that. But one of the ways to do that, I think, is to at least for a time, try to focus on the positive aspects of it. What good did they do? And maybe you can't come up with that. I don't know. So it's not universal advice. But for most of us, even if we have a little bit of resentment towards someone that we would prefer to just love, if we can focus on the good things they gave us, then maybe we can find mercy and compassion and forgiveness for the wrongs we've suffered by them down the road. So it's just a little exercise that might help and it might not. So sometimes, and that's, you know, I can understand if your relative was eaten by Jeffrey Dahmer, you might not be real anxious to think about him being in heaven. Maybe you're a person of faith and you're a Christian and he ate your brother. And there's a lot of things around that his particular story that's difficult. But I believe that God can redeem anything that we bring him. And while we are repulsed by his actions, God is repulsed by all of our actions.
And if you say, I don't want to be in heaven if Jeffrey's there, he's closer to God than you are. Where does that put you?
Well, I'm not going to judge people who say that, but go right ahead.
Well, the Paul, you know, is a perfect example of how bad he was and how good he became. And yet, even while he was doing good, he said, I have not yet attained it, but I worked for it. And you know, people have different heroes in the Bible or people that they, you know, and Paul, you know, is somebody, he never brags about getting there. He says, I'm working on it. And you look at Paul and the things that he was doing, and yet he's working on stuff that gives me hope.
Well, it's a little bit early, and normally we'd press on a little bit, but it's we're getting in. The next few verses are really the whole heart of the book of James, and I want to start with them and not cut anything off. It's because it's really the theological centerpiece of the book, and brings up a lot of challenges. But it's really good, and I think a very important text. And as we will look at, it's not, I don't think, contradicting Paul, but maybe unpacking Paul a little bit, maybe stretching Paul. And it's sometimes we think we have, as human beings, have to resist almost all the time, have to resist either or thinking that it's this way or it's that way. And there's certainly that teaching in the Bible. There are the sheep and there are the goats. I mean, there's no doubt there's some dualistic thinking in the Bible. But there's also a calling to dwell with things that don't necessarily seem to go together all that easily. Something called paradox. And the millennials are great. They love paradox. They think everything is a paradox. So that's why they can, do a lot of the stuff they do and still think that they're great people because it's all paradoxical.
One thing, some of us have no problem reconciling James and Paul and what James is talking about. We figured that out. Everybody has their own thing that they're having to work through or deal with. And just because you have figured out that 2 + 2 is 4, if they're still struggling with it, that's their struggle, and you should not belittle or begrudge them of having that struggle. That's their struggle, and they're working on it. They may have figured out something that you're struggling with and can't understand why. How come you can't understand it? And so we need to, and I guess this ties in with the judging part. We're each on our own journey, and we need to accept people where they're at and not belittle them because they're not supposedly at the same level you are, I guess.
Okay. Well, you got our closing prayer, so we'll let you have the final word there too. How about that?